My name is Jessica Brennan. For 12 years, I built emergency response systems that saved lives during natural disasters. I designed the evacuation protocols for Hurricane Matthew, coordinated relief efforts after the California wildfires, and helped establish the rapid deployment networks that got medical supplies to remote areas within hours instead of days. When FEMA needed someone who could think 3 steps ahead of chaos, they called me. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. But standing in the parking lot of the Riverside County Courthouse at 8 in the morning, watching my own parents walk up the steps with their attorney, I realized that all my training in crisis management meant nothing when the crisis was blood deep and 20 years in the making. The call had come 3 days earlier. My mother's voice, crisp and businesslike, the tone she used when discussing quarterly taxes or insurance renewals. Jessica, we need to meet. There are some financial matters we need to resolve regarding your grandmother's estate. I should have known something was wrong. My grandmother passed away 6 months ago, and I handled her funeral arrangements, paid for the service, even organized the reception at her favorite restaurant downtown. My parents had barely spoken during the entire process, just nodded when I asked about flower arrangements and gave one-word answers about the eulogy. What kind of financial matters? I'd asked, balancing my phone between my shoulder and ear while reviewing disaster response budgets at my kitchen table. It's complicated. We'll explain everything when we see you. Can you meet us at Henderson & Associates tomorrow at 10? Henderson & Associates, the law firm that handled my grandmother's will. The same firm where, just 6 months ago, I'd sat in a mahogany-paneled conference room and listened as the attorney read aloud my grandmother's final wishes. The house on Maple Street, the one where I'd spent every summer as a child, the one with the wraparound porch and the oak tree I'd climbed until I was 16, all of it left to me. My parents had seemed fine with it then. Sad, of course, but understanding. She always had a special connection with you, Jess, my father had said, his hand warm on my shoulder. She'd want you to have it. Now, walking into that same conference room, everything felt different. The air was thicker, charged with something I couldn't name. My parents sat on one side of the polished table, their attorney, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses I didn't recognize, on the other. There was no chair pulled out for me. Jessica, my mother said, not looking up from the papers spread in front of her, we're glad you could make it. The attorney cleared his throat. Ms. Brennan, I'm Robert Stevenson. I represent Harold and Margaret Brennan in this matter. He slid a thick manila folder across the table. We've discovered some irregularities in your grandmother's estate distribution that need to be addressed immediately. I opened the folder. Inside were property deeds, bank statements, and legal documents covered in highlighted text and sticky notes. My name appeared on several pages, but not in the way I expected. I'm not following, I said, looking up. What kind of irregularities? My father leaned forward, his expression serious. Jessica, it appears that during grandmother's final months, when she was not entirely lucid, someone may have influenced her to make certain financial decisions that weren't in her best interest. Someone influenced her? The words felt strange in my mouth. The property transfer, my mother said, her voice measured and careful. The house, the savings accounts, even her life insurance policy, all transferred to your name in the final 6 weeks before her death, when she was on heavy medication for pain management. I stared at the documents. But the will was changed, Stevenson interrupted. Multiple times, actually. The original will, dated 3 years ago, left the estate divided equally among her 3 children, your father and his 2 siblings. But then came a series of amendments, each one transferring more assets to you specifically. My hands felt cold. Are you saying I somehow manipulated my own grandmother? We're saying the circumstances raise questions, my father said quietly. You were the only one with regular access to her during those final weeks. You handled her medical appointments, managed her finances, even had power of attorney. Because you asked me to, the words came out sharper than I intended. You said you were too busy with work, that it would be easier if one person handled everything. My mother's expression didn't change. We're not accusing you of anything intentional, Jessica, but the fact remains that these transfers occurred under questionable circumstances. and we believe the estate should be distributed according to grandmother's original intentions. Stevenson opened another folder. We're prepared to file a formal challenge to the estate distribution. However, we're hoping we can resolve this amicably. We're asking you to voluntarily surrender the assets and agree to a redistribution that reflects the original will. I looked around the room. My parents, who'd raised me, supported my education, celebrated my career achievements. At the attorney with his neat stack of papers and patient, professional expression. At the documents that somehow painted me as a manipulative opportunist who'd taken advantage of a dying woman. What if I don't agree? The silence stretched for several heartbeats. Then we'll have no choice but to pursue this through the courts, Stevenson said. And I should mention, we've already filed preliminary paperwork with the district attorney's office. If the estate challenge moves forward, there's a possibility of criminal charges. Elder financial abuse is a serious felony in this state. The room tilted slightly. Criminal charges? My mother reached across the table, her fingers barely brushing mine. We don't want it to come to that, sweetheart. We just want what's fair. I pulled my hand back. Fair would have been having this conversation 6 months ago. Fair would have been including me in whatever concerns you had instead of ambushing me with lawyers and threats. It's not a threat, my father said. It's just the reality of the situation. These kinds of cases, they can get complicated quickly. I stood up, the chair scraping against the hardwood floor. I need time to think about this. Of course, Stevenson said, sliding a business card across the table. But I should mention, we'll need a response within 72 hours. The preliminary court date is already scheduled. Outside, the October air bit at my face as I walked to my car. My phone buzzed with a text message from my mother. We love you, Jess. We just want to do what's right for everyone. I sat in the driver's seat for 20 minutes, staring at that message, trying to understand how doing what's right had somehow become synonymous with accusing me of elder abuse and threatening me with prison time. That night, I called my grandmother's neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, the woman who'd brought soup during grandmother's final weeks and helped me coordinate the hospice care. Oh, honey, she said when I explained what was happening. I was wondering when this would come up. What do you mean? Your parents. They came by the house several times after the funeral. Asked a lot of questions about your grandmother's final days, about who visited, about her mental state. I told them the same thing I'm telling you. Your grandmother was sharp as a tack until the very end, knew exactly what she was doing. Quote, I gripped the phone tighter. Did they say why they were asking? Said they were just trying to understand her final wishes better. But honey, I've lived next door for 30 years. I know what I saw. And what I saw was a woman who trusted you completely and wanted to make sure you were taken care of. After I hung up, I sat in my living room surrounded by boxes of my grandmother's things. Photo albums, recipe cards, the antique jewelry box she'd given me on my 16th birthday. Things I'd brought from her house because I couldn't bear to leave them empty and waiting. I opened the jewelry box, listening to the familiar melody it played. The same song I'd heard countless times as a child. Inside, tucked beneath the velvet lining, was something I'd never noticed before. A small manila envelope with my name written in my grandmother's careful handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a letter, dated just 2 weeks before she died. My dearest Jessica, it began. If you're reading this, then the wolves have finally shown their teeth. The letter was written in my grandmother's distinctive handwriting, each word carefully formed despite the tremor that had affected her hands in those final weeks. I read it 3 times before the full meaning sank in. My dearest Jessica, if you're reading this, then the wolves have finally shown their teeth. I've suspected for months that Harold and Margaret have been planning something. They've asked too many questions about my finances, made too many suggestions about updating my will. Last week, Margaret brought papers for me to sign, claiming they were medical forms. I may be old, but I'm not foolish. I signed nothing. My hands shook as I continued reading. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. I've made arrangements to protect what rightfully belongs to you. Everything I've done has been documented and witnessed. Mrs. Patterson has copies of important papers in her basement safe. The combination is your birthday, month, day, year. Trust no one in the family except yourself. They see dollar signs where they should see love. Be strong, my dear girl. The truth always finds its way to the surface. It was signed with her full name, Eleanor May Brennan, and dated just 12 days before her death. I stared at the paper until the words blurred. My grandmother knew. She'd seen this coming and tried to warn me, but I'd been too consumed with managing her care, coordinating with doctors, and handling the practical details of her final days to notice the undercurrents of family politics swirling around us. The next morning, I called in sick to work and drove to my grandmother's neighborhood. Mrs. Patterson answered her door before I'd finished knocking, as if she'd been watching for me from her kitchen window. "I was wondering when you'd find that letter," she said, ushering me into her small, neat living room. "Eleanor told me you'd come looking for answers eventually." "You knew about this?" She disappeared into her basement and returned with a small fireproof safe. Inside were photocopies of documents I'd never seen before. Bank statements showing large withdrawals from my grandmother's accounts, real estate assessments that valued her house at nearly twice what I'd estimated, and correspondence with a financial advisor I didn't recognize. "Your grandmother was more worried than she let on," Mrs. Patterson explained. "About 3 months before she passed, your father started visiting more frequently, always asking about her investments, her property values, whether she'd considered downsizing. She found it strange because he'd barely visited in the 2 years before that." I studied the bank statements. Someone had been systematically withdrawing money from my grandmother's checking account, small amounts at first, then larger sums in the final weeks. The signature on the withdrawal slips looked like my grandmother's, but something about the handwriting seemed off. "Mrs. Patterson, did my grandmother ever mention feeling pressured to sign anything?" Quote. The older woman's expression darkened. "About 6 weeks before she died, your mother came by with some man in a suit. Said he was a notary, that they needed to update some paperwork for your grandmother's insurance. I was in my garden when they arrived, and I could hear raised voices through the open windows." "What kind of voices?" "Your grandmother sounded upset, saying she didn't understand why she needed to sign anything. Your mother insisted it was just a formality. The man kept saying something about legal requirements and deadlines." I felt sick. "Did you see what they were signing?" I walked over with some fresh tomatoes as an excuse to check on her. The man packed up his papers real quick when I knocked. Your mother looked flustered, said they were just handling some routine business. That afternoon, I drove to the address on the financial advisor's letterhead. Hartwell Investment Services occupied a small office in a strip mall between a dry cleaner and a tax preparation service. The receptionist, a young woman with elaborate nail art, looked confused when I asked to speak with someone about my grandmother's account. "I'm sorry, but we don't have any clients by that name," she said after checking her computer. "Are you sure you have the right company?" I showed her the letterhead. She frowned and called over her supervisor, a middle-aged man in a wrinkled shirt who examined the documents carefully. "This isn't our letterhead," he said finally. "Similar, but not ours. See the logo? Ours has 3 lines under the company name. This one has 2. And this address, we've been at this location for 8 years, but this shows a P.O. box we've never used." "So these documents are fake?" "I can't say that definitively, but they're definitely not from us. You might want to contact the state regulatory board. They keep records of all licensed financial advisors." Walking back to my car, I felt the ground shifting beneath my feet. The fake letterhead, the suspicious withdrawals, the pressure to sign documents. It painted a picture I didn't want to believe. My own parents hadn't just challenged my inheritance. They'd apparently been manipulating my grandmother's finances while she was vulnerable and dying. That evening, I called the one person I thought might have answers. My Uncle David, my father's younger brother who lived in Portland. We'd always gotten along well, and he'd been genuinely fond of grandmother. "Jessica, I'm so glad you called," he said, his voice warm but strained. "I've been wanting to talk to you about some things, but I wasn't sure how to bring them up." "What kind of things?" "Well, your father called me about 2 weeks ago. Said there were problems with your mother's estate, that you might have taken advantage of her condition to get more than your share. He wanted to know if I'd support a legal challenge." My stomach clenched. "What did you tell him?" "I told him he was out of his mind. You were the only one who took care of her at the end. The only one who visited regularly. who made sure she had everything she needed. The rest of us were too busy with our own lives to be bothered. David paused, and I could hear him moving around, probably pacing his kitchen the way he did when he was agitated. But there's something else, Jess. Something that's been bothering me. About 3 months ago, your father asked me for a loan. $20,000. Said it was for some business opportunity that couldn't wait. I gave it to him because he's my brother, but he was supposed to pay me back within 60 days. When I asked about it last month, he got angry, said the deal fell through and he'd need more time. Did he say what the business opportunity was? Something about real estate investment. But here's the thing. Right after that conversation, he started talking about how Mother's house was worth more than any of us realized, and how the property values in her neighborhood had skyrocketed. It felt like he was building up to something. I closed my eyes, trying to process what I was hearing. Uncle David, do you think they were planning this before Grandmother even died? I think your father has been in some kind of financial trouble for a while now. And I think when he realized how much Mother's estate was worth, he saw it as a solution to his problems. But Jess, you have to understand, what they're doing isn't just wrong. It's cruel. You're the one who earned that inheritance by being there for her when no one else would. After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen surrounded by the evidence I'd gathered. The fake financial advisor documents, the suspicious bank withdrawals, the letter from my grandmother warning me about wolves, and now the revelation that my father was in debt and had been planning this challenge for months. The 72-hour deadline was approaching fast. I had to decide whether to surrender everything to avoid a court battle, or fight back against people who'd apparently been orchestrating this betrayal for months while I held my grandmother's hand and helped her face her final days with dignity. I looked at the photo on my refrigerator, Grandmother and me at last year's Christmas dinner, her arm around my shoulders, both of us laughing at something my cousin had said. She'd trusted me with her legacy because she knew I'd honor her memory and her wishes. The wolves had shown their teeth, just as she'd predicted, but they'd underestimated something crucial. I'd learned to fight from the woman they were trying to erase. The next morning, I called the only attorney I knew personally, Amanda Chen, a former college roommate who'd specialized in estate law after graduation. We'd kept in touch sporadically over the years, exchanging holiday cards and the occasional LinkedIn message, but I'd never needed her professional services before. Jessica, it's been ages, she said when I reached her office. Though I have to say, you sound terrible. What's going on? I explained the situation as clearly as I could, from the initial meeting with my parents' attorney to the evidence I'd been uncovering about financial manipulation. Amanda listened without interrupting, occasionally making small sounds of concern or surprise. Okay, stop right there, she said when I finished. Before we go any further, I need you to understand something. If what you're describing is accurate, we're not just talking about a family dispute over inheritance. We're potentially looking at elder financial abuse, fraud, and possibly forgery. These are serious criminal matters. I know, that's exactly what I'm afraid of. No, you're missing my point. I mean, your parents could be facing serious criminal charges, prison time. This isn't about hurt feelings or family drama anymore. The weight of that statement settled over me. What should I do? First, don't respond to their 72-hour ultimatum without legal representation. Second, we need to secure all the evidence you've gathered and start documenting everything properly. Third, I'm going to refer you to someone who specializes in financial crimes. This is beyond basic estate law. She gave me the name of a forensic accountant named Marcus Rodriguez, who worked with law enforcement on complex fraud cases. Tell him I sent you, and bring everything you've found so far. Every document, every conversation, every suspicious detail. That afternoon, I sat in Rodriguez's downtown office, watching him examine the fake letterhead through a magnifying glass. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe mid-30s, with the focused intensity of someone who found patterns in numbers the way other people found shapes in clouds. This is amateur work, he said, setting down the document. Whoever created this fake letterhead didn't understand basic financial industry standards. The license numbers are wrong, the formatting is off, and the regulatory disclaimers are missing required language. He pulled up something on his computer. Here's the real Hartwell Investment Services. Licensed, bonded, legitimate business. Now look at this fake version your grandmother supposedly received. Different phone numbers, different addresses, and most importantly, the account statements show investment returns that would be impossible in the current market. So someone created an entire fake investment company? Not just fake, fictional, and not very well. But here's what's interesting. He pointed to a series of numbers at the bottom of each statement. These routing codes correspond to a real bank, but they're formatted incorrectly for the type of transactions being shown. It's like someone copied the format from legitimate statements but didn't understand how the underlying systems actually work. Rodriguez leaned back in his chair. Tell me about your father's financial background. Does he work in banking or investment? He's an insurance adjuster. It has been 20 years. So he'd have access to lots of financial documents through his work, enough to create convincing fakes, but maybe not enough technical knowledge to get all the details right. The pieces were starting to fit together in a way that made me sick. What about the bank withdrawals? The ones with my grandmother's signature? Rodriguez pulled out a different set of documents. I had a handwriting expert take a preliminary look at these. The signatures are consistent with someone trying to copy your grandmother's handwriting, but there are microtremors and pressure variations that suggest forgery. A formal analysis would be needed for court purposes, but informally, these weren't signed by the same person who wrote the letter you found. So my parents were systematically stealing from my grandmother while she was dying? That's what the evidence suggests. But here's the bigger question. Where did that money go? The withdrawals total almost $40,000 over 6 months. That's not pocket change that just disappears. He showed me a financial tracking chart he'd begun creating. I've started mapping the withdrawal patterns against other financial data you've provided. The timing is interesting. Most of the larger withdrawals occurred right after your father's visits to your grandmother, and they seem to correlate with some significant expenses on his end. What kind of expenses? Well, that's where it gets complicated. To really trace this money, I'd need access to your parents' bank records, credit card statements, maybe even tax returns. That's not something we can get without either their cooperation or a court order. Rodriguez pulled out a legal pad and began making notes. Here's what I recommend. We document everything we have, create a timeline of events, and then we set a trap. What kind of trap? We give them exactly what they think they want, but we do it in a way that forces them to reveal more about their scheme. I'm thinking we propose a settlement negotiation, but we structure it so they have to provide documentation of their claims. He drew a simple diagram showing the flow of information. Right now, they're controlling the narrative. They've painted you as the bad actor and positioned themselves as the victims. But if we can get them to present their quote says in a formal setting, we can examine it properly and likely expose the forgeries. Won't that be risky? What if their fake documents are good enough to fool a judge? That's the beauty of financial forensics. Numbers don't lie, even when people do. Every financial transaction leaves digital footprints. Every forged document has microscopic inconsistencies. Every lie creates contradictions that become visible when you know how to look. Rodriguez handed me his card. I want you to go home and write down everything you remember about your grandmother's final months. Every visit from your parents. Every conversation about money or legal matters. Every time someone mentioned updating documents or handling paperwork. Details you might think are insignificant could be crucial. That evening, I started what became a 20-page timeline of events. I wrote down every conversation I could remember, every strange moment that had seemed off at the time but that I'd dismissed as grief or stress. The pattern that emerged was chilling. My parents had been asking questions about my grandmother's finances for almost a year before her death. They'd volunteered to help with various paperwork issues. They'd suggested changes to her banking arrangements for security reasons. They'd even recommended the notary who'd supposedly helped with insurance forms. The more I wrote, the clearer it became that this hadn't been an opportunistic grab for inheritance money. This had been a carefully planned campaign to systematically drain my grandmother's assets while positioning themselves to challenge any bequests to me. I was still writing when my phone rang. It was my mother. "Jessica, we haven't heard from you," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone of maternal concern that had always made me feel guilty as a child. "The deadline is tomorrow. We really need to resolve this." "I'm working on it, Mom." Sweetheart, I know this is hard. We don't want to fight with you. We just want what's fair for everyone. What's fair would have been including me in these decisions from the beginning instead of ambushing me with lawyers and threats. There was a pause. We tried to handle this quietly, but you have to understand our position. The circumstances around those final transfers were questionable. We have documentation showing that grandmother wasn't in the right state of mind to make such significant financial decisions. What kind of documentation? Medical records, testimony from healthcare providers, financial analysis showing the transfers were inconsistent with her previous decision-making patterns. We didn't want to have to use any of this, but if you force us to go to court... My blood went cold. They had more fabricated evidence ready to deploy. I need to see this documentation before I make any decisions. Of course, we can arrange that. Why don't you come by the house tomorrow evening? We can sit down as a family and go through everything together. No lawyers, just us. After I hung up, I stared at my timeline of events. Tomorrow evening. Just the family. No lawyers present to witness whatever documentation they plan to show me. I called Rodriguez and left a voicemail. They want to meet tomorrow night to show me more evidence. I think they're planning to present more forged documents, and they want to do it without any witnesses who might spot the problems. Then I called Amanda Chen. I need you to file an emergency motion first thing tomorrow morning. I think my parents are about to make a very big mistake, and I want to make sure there's a legal record of everything they're planning to claim. The next morning, Amanda filed an emergency motion to preserve all financial records related to my grandmother's estate, citing suspected fraud and the need to prevent destruction of evidence. By noon, we had a court order freezing any further transfers or changes to the disputed assets. This buys us time, Amanda explained over the phone. Your parents can't touch anything now without court approval. More importantly, they can't destroy any evidence they might have created. That afternoon, I drove to my childhood home for what I suspected would be the most difficult conversation of my life. The house looked exactly the same, red brick colonial with white shutters, the maple tree in the front yard that my father had planted when I was 7. But as I walked up the familiar driveway, I felt like I was approaching enemy territory. My mother answered the door with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Jessica, come in. Your father's in the study. The study had always been my father's sanctuary, lined with insurance manuals and family photos. He sat behind his desk, several manila folders arranged in front of him like a presentation. He looked older than I remembered, his hair grayer, his face more lined with stress. Thank you for coming, he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. We want to clear this up as much as you do. My mother sat in the other chair, and for a moment we looked like a normal family, having a normal discussion. Then my father opened the first folder. These are medical records from grandmother's final months, he said, sliding papers across the desk. You can see here that her doctor noted increasing confusion and memory issues. The medication she was taking for pain management can cause cognitive impairment in elderly patients. I examined the documents. They looked official, correct letterhead, doctor's signature, even proper formatting. But something felt wrong. These are dated differently than what I remember. Grandmother was sharp right up until the end. She was having lucid conversations about current events, remembering details about my work projects. People with cognitive decline can have good days and bad days, my mother said gently. You might have seen her during her better moments. Quote. My father pulled out another folder. These are financial records showing her decision-making patterns over the past few years. You can see she was generally conservative with her money, making small, predictable investments. Then suddenly, in her final months, she's making large transfers and changing beneficiaries. It's not consistent with her established behavior. He was right about her conservative approach to money, but he was wrong about the timeline. Dad? Most of these large transfers you're showing happened after she gave me power of attorney. I handled those transactions because she asked me to consolidate her accounts to make bill paying easier. But look at this, my mother said, pointing to a highlighted section. This shows that you transferred money from her savings account to your personal account multiple times. I stared at the documents. They showed transfers I'd never made, amounts I'd never seen, dates that didn't match my memory of events. These aren't right, I never transferred money to my personal account. Every financial transaction I handled for grandmother went through her designated accounts or was for specific bills. My father's expression remained patient, almost pitying. Jessica, we understand this is difficult to accept. Sometimes when people are under stress, caregiving for a dying relative, they make decisions they might not remember clearly later. The implication hit me like a physical blow. They weren't just accusing me of financial manipulation. They were suggesting I'd done it unconsciously, perhaps even while believing I was acting in grandmother's best interest. I want to see the bank records these came from, I said. The original statements, not these summaries. My parents exchanged a glance. We can arrange that, my mother said, but first we want to show you something else. She pulled out a small digital recorder. We found this in grandmother's things after she passed. She sometimes recorded herself talking through important decisions. This was dated just 3 weeks before she died. She pressed play. My grandmother's voice filled the room, weak but recognizable. I'm so confused about these financial matters. Jessica keeps telling me I need to sign papers, that it's for my own good, but I don't understand why everything has to change so suddenly. I just want to make sure everyone is taken care of when I'm gone. The recording stopped. My parents watched my face carefully, waiting for my reaction. I never pressured her to sign anything. I helped her understand documents that other people brought to her. Who were these other people? My father asked. You, Mom, the notary you recommended, the financial advisor whose letters were in her mail. Another glance between my parents. Jessica, we never recommended any financial advisor, and we certainly never brought a notary to grandmother's house. The room spun slightly. Either my memory was completely wrong, or they were lying so smoothly that they'd almost convinced themselves. Then who was the man in the suit? Mrs. Patterson saw him there with Mom. My mother frowned. Mrs. Patterson is 83 years old and has early-stage macular degeneration. Her eyesight isn't reliable anymore. She seemed pretty clear about what she saw. She's also been very protective of you since grandmother passed, my father said. She might be remembering things the way she thinks they should have happened, rather than how they actually occurred. I felt like I was drowning in carefully constructed lies. Every piece of evidence I thought I had was being explained away. Every witness discredited. Every memory questioned. If I hadn't found my grandmother's warning letter, I might have started believing their version of events myself. I need to use the bathroom, I said, standing up abruptly. Of course, sweetheart, my mother said. Take your time. I walked upstairs to the bathroom I'd used throughout childhood, but instead of going inside, I slipped into my old bedroom. It had been converted into a home office, but my father's filing cabinet was there, the same one he'd used for years to organize his insurance work. I opened the top drawer, looking for anything that might contradict the story they were telling downstairs. Most of it was routine paperwork, but in the back, behind folders of old tax returns, I found something that made my heart race. A manila envelope labeled Eleanor Brennan Estate Research in my father's handwriting. Inside were property appraisals for my grandmother's house, multiple appraisals from different companies, all dated from several months before her death. There were also printouts of real estate comparisons showing recent sales in her neighborhood, and a handwritten list of renovation costs that could increase the property value. At the bottom of the pile was a bank loan application in my father's name, with my grandmother's house listed as collateral. The application was dated 6 months before her death and marked approved minus $75,000. My hands shook as I photographed the documents with my phone. My father hadn't just been planning to challenge my inheritance. He'd already borrowed money against property he didn't own, using falsified documentation to convince the bank that he had a legitimate claim to the house. I heard footsteps on the stairs and quickly shoved the papers back into the envelope. Jessica, is everything okay up there? My mother called. Just a minute, I called back, my voice somehow steady despite the thundering of my heart. When I returned to the study, my parents were reviewing their documents, making small talk about needing to update their own wills. They looked up when I entered, their expressions concerned and loving. Feeling better? My mother asked. Much better, I said. Actually, I think I'm starting to understand your concerns. Maybe we should involve our attorneys and see if we can work out a fair resolution. My father smiled for the first time all evening. That's all we've ever wanted, Jessica. Just a fair resolution that honors what grandmother really intended. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, downloading the photos I'd taken in my father's office and organizing them alongside everything else Rodriguez and I had compiled. The loan documents changed everything. They proved premeditation and showed that my father had committed bank fraud by using property he didn't legally own as collateral. At 6 a.m, I called Rodriguez's emergency line. "I found it," I said when he answered. "The smoking gun. My father took out a $75,000 loan using my grandmother's house as collateral, 6 months before she died." "Hold on," Rodriguez said, and I could hear him moving around, probably getting coffee. "Walk me through this slowly. What exactly did you find?" I described the loan application, the multiple property appraisals, and the renovation cost estimates. He wasn't just planning to steal the inheritance. He'd already spent it. That's why he's so desperate to challenge the will. If he can't get the house, he can't repay the loan. "Jessica, this is huge. Bank fraud using falsified collateral is a federal crime. We're talking about potential prison time, not just civil penalties." "There's more," I said, scrolling through the other photos. I found correspondence with a real estate development company. They're planning to tear down grandmother's house and build condominiums. My father negotiated a preliminary contract to sell the property for almost 3 times its current value. Rodriguez was quiet for a moment. So the timeline is, he researches the property value, realizes it's worth much more than anyone knew, takes out a loan using the house as collateral, then starts systematically draining your grandmother's other assets to fund the fraud. When she dies and leaves everything to you instead of him, he has to either steal it back or face criminal charges for the loan fraud. That's exactly what happened. And now I understand why they were so confident about their legal challenge. They weren't just hoping to win, they had to win. Okay, here's what we're gonna do. I'm calling Amanda Chen and setting up an emergency meeting for this morning. We need to get all of this evidence to the district attorney's office immediately. Your parents have committed multiple felonies, and there might be other victims we don't know about yet. 3 hours later, I sat in a conference room at the DA's office across from Assistant District Attorney Sarah Valdez, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who specialized in financial crimes. She'd spent the past hour reviewing our evidence with the methodical precision of someone who'd seen every possible variation of family financial fraud. "This is one of the most comprehensive elder abuse cases I've seen in years," she said, looking up from the documents. "The scope of the fraud is impressive in the worst possible way. We have forgery, identity theft, bank fraud, elder financial abuse, and conspiracy to commit fraud." "What happens next?" I asked. "We're going to set up a controlled operation. Your parents think they're winning this battle, which means they're likely to get overconfident and make mistakes. We want to give them the opportunity to incriminate themselves further." Valdez opened a new folder. "Here's what I'm proposing. You're going to call them and agree to their settlement demands, but you're going to ask for a formal mediation session where everything is recorded and documented. They'll have to present all their evidence officially, which gives us the chance to examine their forgeries in a legal setting. Won't they be suspicious if I suddenly cave to their demands? Not if you frame it right. Tell them you've consulted with attorneys who advised you that fighting this could be expensive and risky. Say you want to resolve it quickly and amicably. Most fraudsters expect their victims to eventually give up when the legal pressure becomes too intense." Amanda Chen leaned forward. "Sarah's right. Your parents have invested too much in this scheme to back down now. They'll be so focused on getting what they want that they won't notice the trap we're setting." Valdez pulled out a legal pad. "During the mediation, we need them to present their forged documents as evidence. We need them to repeat their false claims under oath. Most importantly, we need them to explain how they obtained certain pieces of evidence that should have been impossible for them to access legally." "Like what?" "Like your grandmother's supposedly private audio recordings about being confused. If those recordings are real, how did they get access to them? If they're fake, we can prove that through audio analysis. Either way, they'll have to explain the chain of custody in a way that exposes their deception." Rodriguez had been quietly taking notes. "I've been thinking about the financial timeline," he said. If we can get them to present their version of your grandmother's financial records during mediation, I can cross-reference those with the real bank records we've obtained. Any discrepancies will be immediately obvious. The beauty of this approach, Valdez continued, is that once they've presented false evidence in a formal legal setting, we have them on perjury charges, in addition to everything else. And perjury committed during estate fraud proceedings carries enhanced penalties. I felt a mixture of excitement and dread. What if they realize it's a trap? Then they back down and we prosecute them based on the evidence we already have. But I don't think they will. Fraudsters who've gotten this far usually believe their own lies. They've convinced themselves that they're the victims and you're the criminal. That kind of self-deception makes people reckless. Amanda nodded. Plus, they've already committed to this path publicly. They've filed legal documents, made statements to attorneys, probably told extended family members about your supposed crimes. It would be very difficult for them to walk back all of those claims without admitting they were lying. Valdez handed me a script she'd written. Here's what you're going to say when you call them. Keep it simple. Sound defeated but cooperative. The goal is to make them think they've won while getting them to agree to a formal mediation session. That afternoon, I called my mother from the DA's office, with Valdez and Amanda listening on speakerphone. Mom, I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, and I've decided you're right. I don't want to put the family through a long legal battle. Oh, Jessica, I'm so relieved to hear you say that. We never wanted to fight with you. I know. I spoke with an attorney this morning, and she advised me that these kinds of cases are very expensive and unpredictable. She thinks it would be better to resolve this through mediation rather than going to court. That sounds very reasonable. Your father will be so pleased. The attorney suggested we schedule a formal mediation session where everyone can present their evidence, and we can work out a fair settlement. Would you and Dad be willing to do that? Of course. When were you thinking? As soon as possible. Maybe Friday? The mediator wants all parties to bring their documentation so everything can be reviewed properly. That works perfectly. We have all the evidence organized already. Jessica, I really think this is the right decision. Once you see everything we've found, you'll understand our concerns. After I hung up, Valdez smiled grimly. Perfect. They took the bait completely. Friday gives us 3 days to prepare our counter-evidence and set up the recording equipment. Rodriguez was already working on his laptop. I'll have a complete financial analysis ready by Thursday. Every transaction, every discrepancy, every impossible claim in their documentation will be highlighted and cross-referenced. What about the audio recording they played for me yesterday? I asked. I'm having that analyzed by the FBI's Forensic Audio Lab, Valdez said. If it's been manipulated or fabricated, we'll know by Friday morning. Amanda gathered her papers. Jessica, I want you to understand what's about to happen. Once we expose this fraud in mediation, your parents will likely be arrested within hours. There won't be any going back or trying to repair family relationships. Are you prepared for that? I thought about my grandmother's letter, about the months of careful manipulation she'd endured while dying, about the way my parents had looked me in the eye and accused me of elder abuse while knowing they were the ones who'd committed those exact crimes. They made their choice when they decided to steal from a dying woman, I said. Now they have to live with the consequences. But even as I said it, I knew that Friday would be the day I either got justice for my grandmother or lost my family forever. And despite everything they'd done, that choice still felt like losing pieces of myself I could never get back. Friday morning arrived gray and cold, the kind of weather that makes everything feel ominous. I stood in the parking lot of the mediation center, watching my parents walk toward the building with their attorney, Robert Stevenson. They looked confident, almost cheerful. My father carried a thick briefcase, and my mother had dressed as if she were attending an important business meeting. They had no idea that 3 floors above them, Assistant District Attorney Sarah Valdez was monitoring every word through hidden recording equipment. The mediation room was deliberately neutral. Beige walls, a large conference table, and no windows. The mediator, Judge Patricia Wong, was a retired family court judge with 30 years of experience in estate disputes. She didn't know about the criminal investigation, only that this was a contentious inheritance case requiring careful documentation. Before we begin, Judge Wong said, settling into her chair, I want to establish the ground rules. This session is being recorded for legal purposes. Everything said here is under oath and can be used in subsequent legal proceedings. Each party will present their evidence and will work toward a resolution that serves everyone's interests. My parents nodded eagerly. I kept my expression neutral, though my heart was hammering. Mr. and Mrs. Brennan, you've initiated this challenge to the estate distribution. Please present your case. My father opened his briefcase with the confidence of someone who believed he held all the winning cards. Your Honor, we're here because we believe my daughter took advantage of my mother's diminished mental capacity to manipulate her into changing her will and transferring assets inappropriately. He spread documents across the table like a prosecutor presenting evidence. These medical records show that Eleanor Brennan was suffering from medication-induced cognitive impairment during her final months. These financial records show highly unusual transaction patterns that deviate from her established behavior. And this audio recording demonstrates her confusion about the financial changes being made to her accounts. Judge Wong examined each document carefully. These appear comprehensive. Ms. Brennan, have you reviewed this evidence? I have, Your Honor, and I have some questions about its authenticity. My mother's expression flickered slightly, but my father remained confident. Your Honor, I understand that this is difficult for Jessica to accept, but the evidence speaks for itself. Mr. Brennan, can you explain how you obtained your mother's private medical records? Patient privacy laws are quite strict. We were listed as her emergency contacts, my mother said quickly. The doctor's office provided them to us after her death. I handed Judge Wong a document Amanda had prepared. Your Honor, this is a letter from Eleanor Brennan's physician stating that no medical records were ever released to Harold or Margaret Brennan, and that the records presented today don't match the official medical documentation in their files. The first crack appeared in my father's confidence. There must be some mistake. We definitely received these from Dr. Morrison's office. Dr. Morrison retired 18 months before Eleanor Brennan's death, Judge Wong said, reading from the letter. According to this, her care was transferred to Dr. Sarah Kim, who has no record of any communication with you regarding medical records. Stevenson leaned over to whisper something to my father, but Judge Wong continued. Let's move on to these financial records. Mr. Brennan, can you explain how you obtained detailed transaction histories from your mother's bank accounts? She gave us access before she died. For estate planning purposes. I slid another document across the table. Your Honor, this is a statement from First National Bank confirming that Eleanor Brennan never authorized anyone other than myself to access her account information, and that the transaction summaries presented today contain numerous errors and impossible dates. My mother's face was growing pale. There must be some clerical error. Mrs. Brennan, let's discuss this audio recording you presented. When was it made? 3 weeks before my mother-in-law's death. She sometimes recorded her thoughts when she was trying to work through difficult decisions. And how did you obtain this recording? A pause. We found it among her things after she passed. Judge Wong pressed a button on her desk phone. Could you please send in our audio analysis expert? A woman in a lab coat entered, carrying a laptop and several pieces of equipment. Your Honor, I've completed my analysis of the audio recording in question. The voice patterns are consistent with Eleanor Brennan, but the recording has been digitally manipulated. Specifically, words and phrases have been taken from multiple separate recordings and spliced together to create new sentences that were never actually spoken as a continuous statement. The silence in the room was deafening. My father's face had gone completely white. Furthermore, the expert continued, the background noise patterns indicate that the original recordings were made in different locations and at different times, then layered together with artificial ambient sound to make them appear continuous. Judge Wong turned back to my parents. Mr. and Mrs. Brennan, you've presented fabricated medical records, falsified financial statements, and manipulated audio recordings as evidence in this legal proceeding. Do you understand that this constitutes perjury and fraud? Stevenson was frantically shuffling through his papers. Your Honor, my clients were not aware that these documents were problematic. They received them from various sources and believed them to be authentic. What sources? Judge Wong asked sharply. My father's mouth opened and closed silently. There was no good answer because there were no legitimate sources for fabricated evidence. That's when I played my final card. I handed Judge Wong the photographs I'd taken from my father's filing cabinet. Your Honor, these documents show that Harold Brennan took out a $75,000 loan using Eleanor Brennan's house as collateral, 6 months before her death. He falsified ownership documents to convince the bank that he had a legal claim to the property. He also negotiated a preliminary contract to sell the house to developers for demolition. Judge Wong examined the photographs with growing amazement. Mr. Brennan, these documents appear to show that you committed bank fraud by using property you didn't own as loan collateral. That's not... Those documents are taken out of context. What context would make this legal? Judge Wong asked. You borrowed money against property that belonged to your mother, using falsified documentation to prove ownership you didn't possess. At that moment, the doors to the mediation room opened. Assistant District Attorney Sarah Valdez entered, followed by 2 police detectives. Your Honor, I apologize for the interruption, but based on the evidence presented here today, we need to place Harold and Margaret Brennan under arrest. My mother stood up suddenly, her chair scraping against the floor. This is a setup. Jessica planned this whole thing. Mrs. Brennan, Detective Martinez said, stepping forward with handcuffs, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. My father didn't resist as the second detective cuffed him, but he looked at me with an expression of complete bewilderment. Jessica, we're your parents. How could you do this to us? You did this to yourselves, I said quietly, when you decided to steal from your grandmother while she was dying, when you forged documents and manipulated evidence, when you tried to send me to prison for crimes you committed. As they led my parents from the room, my mother turned back one last time. We gave you everything. We raised you, supported you, loved you. And this is how you repay us? You loved the version of me that would quietly disappear when you needed me to, I replied. But I'm not that person anymore. Valdez waited until my parents were gone before approaching me. Jessica, I want you to know that they'll likely be facing 10 to 15 years in federal prison. The bank fraud alone carries a maximum sentence of 30 years, though they'll probably plead down. I nodded, feeling strangely empty. What happened to my grandmother's house? It's yours, free and clear. The bank will have to write off the fraudulent loan since it was obtained illegally. The development contract is void, since your father never had legal authority to negotiate it. Judge Wong gathered her papers. Ms. Brennan, I've been mediating family disputes for over 2 decades, and I've never seen anything quite like this. Your parents didn't just commit fraud, they built an entire alternate reality to justify it. I hope you understand that none of this was your fault. As I walked out of the building, I passed the news vans that had gathered in the parking lot. Someone had leaked the story, and reporters were already calling it one of the most elaborate cases of family financial fraud in the county's history. I didn't stop to talk to them. I had somewhere more important to be. 3 months later, I stood in the doorway of my grandmother's house, breathing in the familiar scent of lavender and old wood that no amount of time could erase. The morning light streamed through the kitchen windows, just like it had when I was 8 years old, sitting at this same table while she taught me to make her famous blueberry pancakes. The house was exactly as she'd left it. After the legal proceedings concluded, I'd chosen not to change anything immediately. The floral wallpaper she'd loved, the china cabinet filled with dishes from her wedding, even the little ceramic angels she collected, everything remained in place, as if she might walk through the door at any moment. Mrs. Patterson knocked softly on the back door, carrying a plate of homemade cookies and wearing the gentle smile that had comforted me through the darkest months of this ordeal. "How are you settling in, dear?" she asked, setting the cookies on the counter. "It's strange," I admitted. "Good, strange, but strange." I keep expecting to hear her voice calling from the living room. "She's still here," Mrs. Patterson said with certainty. "Not in a spooky way, but in all the love she poured into this place. You can feel it in every room." She was right. Despite everything that had happened, despite the betrayal and the legal battles and the family relationships that would never heal, there was something peaceful about being in the space my grandmother had created with such care. I heard from Amanda yesterday, I said, pouring coffee into two of my grandmother's favorite mugs. The sentencing hearing is scheduled for next month. Mrs. Patterson's expression grew solemn. How are you feeling about that? It was a question I'd been wrestling with for weeks. The prosecutors were seeking maximum sentences. My father faced up to 20 years for bank fraud, elder abuse, and conspiracy, while my mother could receive 15 years for her role in the scheme. The evidence had been overwhelming, and their guilty pleas had only confirmed what everyone already knew. Honestly, I feel sad more than anything else. These are people who raised me, who taught me right from wrong, who attended every school play and graduation ceremony. Somewhere along the way, they lost sight of those values, but that doesn't erase the good memories entirely. That's very mature of you, Jessica. Not everyone could separate the parents they once knew from the people who committed these crimes. Quote, I sipped my coffee, thinking about the letters I had been receiving. Some were from strangers who'd read about the case in the news, offering support and sharing their own stories of family financial abuse. Others were from distant relatives who'd taken sides, either supporting my decision to prosecute or condemning me for destroying the family. Uncle David called yesterday, I said. He wanted me to know that he's proud of how I handled everything. He said grandmother would be proud too. She would be, Mrs. Patterson agreed. Eleanor was one of the strongest women I ever knew, but she was also one of the kindest. She'd understand that sometimes love means holding people accountable for their actions, even when it's painful. Over the past months, I'd learned things about my parents that I'd never suspected. The investigation had revealed that their financial problems went back years. Bad investments, overspending, a series of increasingly desperate attempts to maintain a lifestyle they couldn't afford. My grandmother's estate hadn't been their first target. It had just been their last resort. Rodriguez had traced the pattern of their deception back almost 3 years. They'd borrowed against their own house, maxed out credit cards, even taken small amounts from the insurance settlements my father handled at work. The loan against grandmother's property had been the culmination of a long descent into financial desperation. Sometimes I wonder if I could have helped them, I said. If I'd known how much trouble they were in, maybe I could have found a legal way to assist them. Jessica, Mrs. Patterson said firmly, they chose deception over honesty. They chose to victimize a vulnerable elderly woman instead of asking for help. Those were conscious decisions, not mistakes. She was right, but understanding that intellectually and accepting it emotionally were two different things. My phone buzzed with a text message from Rodriguez. Saw the news coverage of the case on CNN. You did the right thing. These cases usually stay hidden because families are afraid to speak up. You've given other victims the courage to come forward. He was referring to something I hadn't expected when this all began. After news of my parents' arrest became public, the district attorney's office had been contacted by 7 other families with similar stories. Elderly relatives who'd been manipulated into changing wills, adult children who discovered forged documents, financial institutions reporting suspicious loan applications using elderly people's assets as collateral. My case had apparently exposed a much larger pattern of elder financial abuse in the community. 3 other people had already been arrested, and investigators were looking into dozens more suspicious cases. I got a call from the state attorney general's office, I told Mrs. Patterson. They want me to speak at a conference about elder financial abuse next month. Share what I learned about recognizing the warning signs. Will you do it? I think so. If talking about this helps other families spot the red flags before it's too late, then maybe some good can come from all this pain. Through the kitchen window, I could see the oak tree where I'd carved my initials as a teenager, now grown so tall it shaded most of the backyard. Life had continued around this house through decades of joy and sorrow, celebration and loss. It would continue long after I was gone, too. I've decided to keep the house, I said, not to live full-time but as a weekend place. Somewhere to come when I need to remember who I am and where I come from. I think that's wonderful. Eleanor always said this house was meant to be filled with love and laughter, not locked up like a museum. As Mrs. Patterson gathered her things to leave, she paused at the door. Jessica, I want you to know something. What you did took tremendous courage. It would have been easier to give in to their demands and walk away. Most people would have chosen family peace over justice. Most people's families don't commit felonies, I replied with a sad smile. No, but most people also don't have the strength to stand up to people they love when those people are doing wrong. Your grandmother raised you right, and she would be incredibly proud of the woman you've become. After she left, I walked through the house slowly, touching the furniture and photographs that held so many memories. In the living room, I found the spot where my grandmother had taught me to play chess, always letting me win until I was old enough to earn the victories myself. In the dining room, I remembered countless holiday meals, my parents laughing and joking with relatives. No hint of the darkness that would eventually consume them. Those memories weren't fake, even if the people who'd created them had made terrible choices later. Part of healing would be learning to hold both truths simultaneously, that my parents had genuinely loved me once, and that they'd still chosen to commit crimes that could have sent me to prison. I opened my laptop and began typing an email to the Attorney General's office, accepting their invitation to speak at the conference. If sharing my story could help other families recognize financial abuse before it destroyed them the way it had destroyed mine, then perhaps something meaningful could emerge from this wreckage. Outside, the sun was setting behind the oak tree, casting long shadows across the yard where my grandmother had taught me to plant tomatoes and pull weeds. Tomorrow, I would start planning the garden for next spring, continuing the cycle of growth and renewal that she'd begun decades ago. The house felt peaceful now, no longer haunted by deception and betrayal, but filled instead with the quiet strength that comes from choosing truth over comfort, justice over silence. My grandmother had been right in her letter. The truth does always find its way to the surface. Sometimes it just takes courage to help it along. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.